So Davide Denti we're talking to you now on your article which you wrote on Europeanization of candidate countries, the case for a shift to the concept of EU member state building, in which you are quite critical of the concept of Europeanization, which has predominated debates about EU enlargement in recent years, and particularly for the Western Balkans. So what motivated you to write this article?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in fact, more than I try to be a bit provocative in this piece of research in the sense that I started from analyzing what had been written on the Europeanization of candidate countries and how these somehow could frame the way that the EU impacts on these candidate countries. And what I found out is that, on the one hand, it seemed that statehood as a variable is the missing link between the fact that conditionality or somehow the different mechanisms of Europeanization which the EU puts in place that do not really work, do not really produce results in situations like those in the Western Balkans where states face open issues of both capacities and legitimacy. And what pushed me to write this is the fact that we do not seem to go through by using this same concept of Europeanization due to the fact that the EU does not seem to have a way to overcome this lack of stateness in candidate countries. So I tried to see which kind of alternatives were possible that could somehow reframe the discussion and allows us to go a step forward. Mm-hmm.
So how do you see, or what do you see as the main weaknesses of the concept of Europeanization then in the literature? I mean, of course, it comes from describing the penetration of the European Union in existing member states, and it's been then extended as a way to describe the enlargement process. And it's been really ubiquitous. I mean, everybody uses this term, maybe also too loosely, but it's really dominated the way in which enlargement has been understood. So where do you see the limitations, really?
Yes, indeed. But on the one hand, I started from looking at all the definitions and see how the definition somehow it stands from a top-down, outcome-focused concept towards a concept which is process-focused and which includes both a top-down and a bottom-up perspective. And somehow this has been somehow lost when this concept has gone to be applied in the European enlargement process, and moreover, in the present enlargement framework. Somehow the present relation between the European Union and its candidate countries seem to be related more to the earlier concepts of Europeanization as a top-down approach than to the later concepts which include this bottom-up uploading perspective, which is more typical of member states and of entities which actually take part of the integration process. This is the first thing. The second thing relates to the fact that we actually use a concept which we call Europeanization, although we actually most of the time refer to what we should call EUization. So something which is more related to the application, the compliance with European directives, European acquis, than to something which is broader, which has to do also with other international organizations, with global influences in the region, which can be parallel or even contradictory with the European ones. Second, besides this, what else we can say is that somehow this lack of conceptual clarity has brought to the fact that we tend to see Europeanization a bit everywhere, but we are not so sure whether what we see is what we are not actually sure of the outcome. So we tend to have adjectivized Europeanization. We tend to see shallow, slow, limited Europeanization, but this kind of research findings do not actually tell us that much about what is going on and what could be done further. Finally, the point that, again, as I said before, pushed me even more was this issue with stateness and the fact that if Europeanization is linked and it's somehow dependent on having a pre-consolidated state on the receiving side or somehow on the participating side, then we don't know what we actually can do and we actually see in the relation between the European Union and weak or not yet consolidated or contested states, as we can call them.
But when you talk about, so you would agree with the emerging kind of, I guess, literature which focuses or which terms it more as EU member state building, I would gather then. So how do you see how do you see this process going about? I mean, what does EU member state building then mean if we distinguish that from Europeanization or EUization?
Well, on the one hand, I think that this concept of member state building can be useful because it allows us to focus on this particular relationship, the one between contested candidate countries and European Union, of which they somehow at some point aspire to be member. And this relation is well described, this concept, in the sense of building functional states while integrating them. So this way, the concept somehow already includes the paradox, which goes in between the fact that the logic of sovereignty concentration, which is typical of state building in any situation, is at odds with the logic of sovereignty diffusion instead, which is typical of European integration. The fact that these two logics has to be dealt with at the time, and the fact that this creates some problems, but can also find some particular way out, is well described as a concept and allows us to better focus on this particular issue.
Beyond the conceptual shift which you are suggesting in your article, I mean, in terms of practical approaches, I mean, how do you see that shift conceptually reflected in the way the European Union could deal with the countries of the Western Balkans? Because arguably, this paradox which you've mentioned between, on one side, wanting to build sovereignty and the other side diffusing that sovereignty once it's in the European Union, has been one of the main challenges, in particular in contested countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina. So do you see that this conceptual shift could also ask us or force us to reconsider, or the European Union to reconsider, the way it's been engaging the accession process in such contested states?
Mm-hmm. Yes, something which has brought my research forward, even after I've written this article, is I've tried to somehow inquire this member state building in its different dimension. It's not yet in the article, but then I've tried to distinguish between a capacity and a legitimacy dimension and see how the European Union actually relate to these contested candidate countries and how its strategies on the ground are actually compatible with this member state building perspective and can be put forward. For instance, on the capacity side, I think we can refer to things such as the way that the European Union pre-accession funds are being implemented and the way that the management system that the EU asks candidate countries to build up in order to deal with these pre-accession funds is a way for the Union to build administrative capacities within candidate countries, and for the sake of having a functional member state after accession, not for the sake of state building, institution building in itself, as it would be under a perspective of international state building. On the other hand, on the legitimacy side, I think we can, second thing that the EU member state building can allow us to better focus on is the way that the EU engages with legitimacy issues in candidate countries. And if we take, for example, the case of the police reform in Bosnia, I think we can say that this resulted in a mismanaged conditionality and overall in a failure of conditionality because the EU was not taking actually care of what it means to be a functional member state in this particular case of functionality of police forces, but instead downloaded some requirements from international state building perspectives and just tried to implement it. Instead, a member state building perspective would propose the union to ventilate different options that could be compatible with with being a working member state, and then allow the domestic debate to take over and to decide somehow which one of these could be applicable to the case. So if we can say this, passing from an obligation of results to an obligation of means.
So it is really, I mean, in many ways what you're arguing, and I think this is part of a broader debate, to shift from not just state building and EU integration as parallel processes which are often badly interconnected, to something which is more basically connected and linked, and where maybe European state building member state building is more ambitious than Europeanization, but also maybe more realistic and less ambitious than the state building agenda we've seen. So in a certain way, a kind of a middle ground between the two. Is that how you would kind of consider the main findings or the main kind of ways forward from what your article is arguing?
Yes, indeed. I would argue first that if we take that Europeanization as a process just doesn't work in the lack of statehood, we just still have to do something about this. We have to do something about stateness in these candidate countries. And this is one of the reasons why we should start to analyze the concept and discuss about member state building. Mm-hmm. The second thing I would argue is that compared to international state building, member state building is, on one hand, less ambitious in the sense that it's not so much top-down, not so much soul, but it also allows us for more local input, for more ownership and legitimacy from the bottom up. And this, I think, is particularly necessary in a situation in which we've seen the drawbacks of prolonged international state building and prolonged international embeddedness and somehow protectorates in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on this article. And of course, there's a lot more in there in the article. And also, I think, a lot more research to be going in this direction. So thank you again.
Thank you.